Yo, welcome to Six Slayers, the comic signature show, period. I'm Mike the Six Slayer, chilling with Mark, the honorable villain. What up, fam?
What's up, animation and comic book nation?
We have a real treat tonight. We have the captain of cartoons, Greg Weisman, with us. But before we chat with Greg, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and please comment. All right, our next guest is an absolute legend in the animation world. He has written and produced for iconic shows like Gargoyles, Star Wars Rebels, Spectacular Spider-Man, and my favorite, Young Justice. Ladies and gentlemen of the Stash Land, we bring to you the one and only Greg Weisman. How you doing, Greg?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. We're going to just dive right on in. So since it's your first time joining us, we always like to get your comic book origin story. How did you get your first gig in pro comics? And how did you make that shift from comics to animation?
I was in college long ago, far away.
Yeah.
And this was back in the days when being a nerd definitely was not cool. Being a geek was definitely not cool. And at my entire college, I only knew one other guy who went to the comic book store every week. And I had a car and he didn't, so I would pick him up. His name was Doug, and Doug and I would go to the local comic book store. In those days, it was Thursdays. We'd go every Thursday and pick up comics. And I got everything. I mean, almost everything. Marvel, DC, I loved it all. And independent stuff too, although there was less of that back then. One month I went, and in every Marvel book they announced this new talent search. They were looking for new artists, new writers. I looked at this and I thought, man, they are just going to get flooded with submissions, just flooded. And I thought, if Marvel's having a new talent search, I bet you anything DC is going to have one too any minute. So instead of prepping Marvel materials, I prepped DC materials. And sure enough, 1 month later, DC announced a new talent search, and I immediately dropped my stuff in the mail. And years later, when I was on staff at DC, I found the logbook where they logged in all the new talent submissions, and I was literally the second name. And the first name on the list, I don't remember that person's name, but I do remember that the address was local to New York, like someone who lived in Manhattan could literally walk it over, kind of thing. And so I was the first one that was received by mail, second one total. And they logged in my name and they logged in my address, and then they promptly lost all my materials. Wow. And again, years later, when I was on staff, I was cleaning out a filing cabinet. And you know how hanging files work?
Yeah.
And if something slips down between two files, it's lost. You can't see it. You can't even see that it was down there. So that's what happened, clearly, because I found, I was pulling entire file folders out, and there on the floor of and I wasn't the only thing down there, but one of the things down on the bottom of that drawer lying flat where you couldn't see it was my original submission from 1983.
Wow.
When I was 19 years old. In any event, I didn't know any of that then. All I knew was that they had two sets of materials that they sent to the people who sent submissions. One was for artists and one was for writers. And about 70% of the people who submitted were artists and had submitted art stuff. So they had my name in the logbook, but they didn't have my submission anymore, and they didn't know whether I was an artist or a writer. And instead of contacting me, they decided to guess. And they guessed, well, most of them are artists. This guy was probably an artist. So they sent me the big pack for an artist. And I was outraged about this in the way that only a 19-year-old can be outraged. So I wrote this letter. I mean, I typed it up on my electric typewriter. A lot of your audience won't even know what a typewriter is, I'm guessing. But in it, I said that I thought this was unprofessional behavior and that I was a professional. That was a lie, but that's what I wrote. I was a professional, so of course I kept copies of all my work. That part was true. And if they couldn't find my materials, and that happens sometimes, all they have to do is contact me and I would send new copies. But it was a real letter with attitude, particularly coming from a guy who'd never done anything before in his life. And I, put that letter in an envelope. I sealed the envelope. I put this thing called a stamp on the envelope, and I walked it over to a mailbox, and I put it in the mailbox. And the second I let go of it, I thought, oh my God, what have I done? I'm never going to work in this business again, ever. I haven't worked on it before. I've just blown my chance. They're going to read this letter and say, what an asshole, and that would be it for me. But you can't break into a mailbox, so I was like, oh, I'm doomed. So a couple weeks later, I'm in my dorm room, and my roommate, who was not a comic book geek and didn't know any of this stuff, the phone rang. We had these things back then, which nowadays you call landlines. Back then we just called it a phone. So he picks up the phone, he answers the phone, my roommate Tom, and he goes, there's some guy called Dick Giordano wants to talk to you. Now, Dick passed away some years ago, so some of your audience may not know, but Dick Giordano at the time was the executive editor of DC Comics, also a phenomenal artist in his own right. Wound up being a huge influence on my life down the road. But at that moment, I thought it was my buddy Doug, because I had told Doug this whole story and about me writing this letter to Dick and how I would never work again. And I'm like, oh right, it's Dick Giordano. Like Dick Giordano's gonna call me. So I take the phone from my roommate and I go, so this is Dick Giordano. And this voice answered, which was clearly not my buddy Doug. And it was Dick Giordano. And he's like, yes, it is Dick Giordano. And I'm immediately like, oh, what have I done? But Dick was actually incredibly cool. And he actually liked my letter. He said, I could see that you can write. And he said, are you coming to New York anytime? And I said, sure, yeah, I'll be there in April. He's like, great. He put me on with his assistant, Alice, who I later became friends with. And Alice and I made an appointment for me to come into the DC Comics offices. And then after the fact, I figured out how the hell am I going to get to New York? I went to school in California. It's 3,000 miles away. So my dad had some frequent flyer miles, and he let me use them to fly to New York. I had a cousin who lived in Manhattan. She let me crash on her couch. I thought it was like a job interview, so I'm like wearing a suit and tie. I'm dressed now. This is sort of fancy for your show relative to how I usually dress. My cousin says, hey, I got you a subway map. Let me show you what route to take so you can get to where you're going. And I said, no, I don't want to take the subway. I'm afraid I'll get lost, get off at the wrong stop, make the wrong connection. So I'm just going to hail a cab. And she says to me, you're going to hail a cab in Manhattan in the rain. And I say, yeah, I think that's probably better. And she doesn't say, yeah, that's impossible. You're never going to find a cab in the rain in Manhattan. She just says, well, good luck with that. And she leaves. So I go out, I've got an umbrella. The umbrella instantaneously folds up backwards, becoming useless within a second. I step off the curb. You know that scene in Groundhog Day, where Bill Murray steps off the curb up to his ankle in a pothole filled with ice water. That happened to me. And then within seconds, because it's raining so hard, I am drenched. And miraculously, after about 20 minutes, I do manage to hail a cab. And really, that was a miracle. By the time I get to the DC's offices, which at the time were at a building called 666 Fifth Avenue, which if that isn't an intimidating address, right. I don't know what is. And by the time I get upstairs, I look something like a drenched rat in my, my little baby suit and everything. But like I said, somehow or other, Dick saw something in me, and I started freelancing for DC Comics my sophomore year of college. I moved to New York for summers, summer between my sophomore and junior year, and between my junior and senior year. And I sold stuff, and none of it got published. I mean, I sold a lot. The first year I didn't sell much, but the second year I sold quite a bit, and I made quite a bit of money, but for all sorts of different reasons, nothing I wrote was getting published. And so I went to Dick at the end of that second summer, and I said, look, I want you to be honest with me. Do you think I've got any ability here? Because if you don't, then I'll try to do something else. I want your sincere. And he said, no, I think you do have something here. In fact, I want to hire you as an associate editor here when you graduate next spring.
Oh, wow.
I'm like, oh, that's so great. That's terrific. And so, all through my senior year, all my friends are worried and they're looking for jobs. And I'm like, hey, I got my job all lined up. I got no problems whatsoever. And then, when it came to the spring, I started writing Dick or phoning him and going, so when do you need me to start? I'm like, I wouldn't mind like a month off after I graduate just to kick back. But if you need me in June, I'll come in June. But if you can wait till July or August, I'm okay with that too. And he's like, oh, we can wait. So, July comes and early July, and I haven't heard anything. And I contact him, and I'm having trouble reaching him, getting through to him all of a sudden. And so he's going to be at Comic-Con in San Diego in 1985.
Wow. And
Comic-Con was not like it is today in 1985. It was a comic book convention, and it was at a hotel. And it was big as comic book conventions go, but nothing like what we know as Comic-Con. So I go down there, and he gets me in for free, as a professional, even though I'd had nothing published. And he says, come with me. And I say, okay, great, Dick. So I want to talk about when I'm starting and the job and everything. And he's like, yeah. Oh, do you want to meet Alan Moore? I'm like, oh, yeah, I do want to meet Alan Moore. So he'd introduce me to Alan Moore, and that'd be so cool. And then, after a little bit, I'm like, hey, Dick, can we talk about... He's like, hey, I'm going to lunch with Dave Stevens. You want to come to lunch with the creator of Rocketeer? I'm like, yeah! So we'd go to lunch, and this went on all day long. I tried to start to talk to him about, the job, and he would say, hey, you want to meet Barb Wolfman and George Ferris? I'm like, yeah, And finally, toward the end of the day, I think he ran out of people to introduce me to. And so I kind of cornered him, and he finally admitted that there was a hiring freeze and that he couldn't bring me on. And he was really sorry. He had said that, and as soon as a hiring freeze lifts, he'd offer me the job, but right now he couldn't do it. And I'm like, oh man. And so I had to decide, was I going to move to New York anyway? Or was I going to try something else or whatever? So I decided to move to New York, get a job, maybe in advertising, try and get something. But I was late because, again, I'd graduated college. All my friends now had jobs, and I hadn't even looked. So I was thinking I might get a job at McDonald's or something. And I was scheduled to go in October to New York, and I found an apartment and everything. Literally the week before I was scheduled to go, Dick calls me and says, "Hey, the hiring freeze is still on, so I can't hire you as an associate editor. But someone just quit as our editorial assistant. And since that slot exists already, I can slot you in there." And I'm like, associate editor, editorial assistant, what's the difference? And basically editorial assistant was, Xerox boy. I would be the guy who was copying stuff, putting packages together to send to the mail room, that kind of thing. And I said, no, I'll take it. So, at least I'd be in the building and that kind of thing. And I worked my way up over the next 6 months from editorial assistant to assistant editor, and then ultimately became an associate editor. Finally, some of my comic book work got published in Captain Atom and a few other places. I even got to write, I found a writing partner, Carrie Bates, and we wrote Captain Atom together. And he had a friend who was a story editor at Sunbow. And so we pitched premises to various Sunbow shows, including the original Transformers show, a handful of others, and we sold one premise to a show called Gem and the Holograms. And we got to write a script.
You talking about Jim, like with the blonde hair, the band group back in the day?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So Carrie and I got a writing credit on one episode of my first television credit on one episode of Gem and the Holograms. And I thought, well, wow, now I'm a TV writer. And I thought it would lead to all this stuff, and it led to absolutely nothing. I got no other jobs out of it. We weren't even able to sell a second premise to Gem or Sunbow, so it led nowhere. But after a couple years, I decided to go to grad school, and I applied to a few places, got in at USC, and moved back to Los Angeles, which is where I'm from. I was still writing Captain Atom freelance in those days. And while I was at USC, I had an interview with a guy named Gary Kreisel, who was the head of television at Walt Disney. But what he was doing that I didn't know was that he was setting up a new division at Disney, which became Walt Disney Television Animation. And this has been a long enough story already, so to just get to the point.
Great story.
He wound up hiring me as a junior executive at Walt Disney TV Animation, and I thought, well, I'll do this job during the day and I'll come home and write at night because I want to be a writer. I don't want to be an executive. But the job was pretty all-consuming, and I ended up not writing much at night. After about a year, I gave up the Captain Atom gig because I was just too busy. And 5 years later, I was director of series development at Walt Disney Television Animation. And I developed a show in 1991 called Gargoyles. It took us a year and a half to sell it. And so in 1993, Gargoyles was going into production, and I really felt a connection to this show. I'd created it and developed it with my team, and it meant a lot to me. And so I went to my bosses, Gary and guy named Bruce Cranston, and I said, I want to move over and produce this show. And they're like, well, I don't know. You've never produced a show before. You've never even, you haven't even written very much for animation. I'm like, well, I've written this and I've written that. And they're like, well, I don't know. Jumping right to producer, that's, usually, you'd work your way up. And he said, yeah, look, I've never produced before, but 5 years ago, I'd never been a TV executive before, and that worked out all right. So, so they decided to let me produce the first season of Gargoyles with Frank Parr, who was my partner and co-showrunner on it. while simultaneously holding down my development executive job. And they would pay me the lesser of those two salaries to do both full-time jobs. And I was very happy and agreed to that. And we did the first season of Gargoyles, which was 13 episodes on a 10-month sliding schedule. And then for season 2, and this is a big story too, but ultimately they ordered 52 episodes for season 2. And I went to Gary and Bruce and I said, there's no way I can do 52 episodes in a 10-month sliding schedule and hold down the development job. So I moved over full-time to being a producer. And from there, after Gargoyles ended, I went to DreamWorks, and after DreamWorks to Sony. And since then, I've been at Sony, Warner Brothers, Disney, DreamWorks, Nickelodeon, Hasbro, Mattel, Lego, probably 3 or 4 I'm leaving out. And I've written comic books and many, many episodes of television.
We both know that you've had a lot of success in animation. Is it true that Gargoyles was first pitched as a comedy? And how did you balance the comedy with the action in the show? So
when I came up with Gargoyles initially, one of the major impetuses for that was we had a television show at Disney TV Animation called Disney's Adventures of the Gummy Bears. And I was a huge fan of this show. I had very little to do with it. It was already up and running by the time I came aboard. It was created by a guy named Jim Magon, who was terrific. By the time I got aboard, Jim had moved on to other stuff, and it was being run by a trio of other people. And my only contribution was, as an executive, I would read the scripts and make suggestions here and there. Right? So I'm not taking any credit for it. I'm just saying that I was a huge fan. And we felt that it was a great show, original idea that didn't get a lot of respect, and we knew why. There was another show on at the same time called the Care Bears, and there was a lot of brand confusion between Care Bears and Gummy Bears. And Care Bears was, okay for what it was, but it was a show that was basically about hugs. Oh, are you sad? Do you want a hug? Yes. And it was kind of saccharinely sweet from our point of view, whereas Gummy Bears was this great adventure comedy. Lots of humor, lots of great characters, great stories, terrific comedic villains, and it just didn't get any respect because they were the sort of saccharine sweet show, but we were the one named after a candy. So you could understand both shows had multicolored little cuddly cute bears. You could understand where the confusion came from. So, during one of my job interviews, someone mentioned Gummy Bears, and I'm like, oh, is that and they're like, no, you're thinking of Care Bears. I had done it too. So I understood why, but the fact was I wanted to do a show like Gummy Bears, but which could get more respect. So this was the 90s, and edgy was a big word in the 90s. Everything had to be edgy.
Yeah.
So we decided to do 2 things to make it edgier. One, we loved how Gummy Bears had this great medieval backstory, and we gave that to the Gargoyles as well. But instead of setting it in medieval times, we decided we'd put a spell on the Gargoyles, put them to sleep for 1,000 years, and have them wake up in modern New York. And we thought, that's edgy. All these medieval little, and they were cute. They were little cute, multicolored monsters. And that was the thing. That was also edgy. Instead of cute bears, cuddly bears, we had cute little monsters. But they were funny, they were comedic, they were colorful, they were small, and they had human friends and comedic villains, and we were just going to have a great time as a comedy show, as an adventure show set in modern day Manhattan. And we pitched that show to Michael Eisner,
okay,
who was at the time chairman of the Walt Disney Corporation, and who chose every show personally back in those days. He was like the last of the Hollywood moguls, and he didn't like it. But my immediate boss, Gary, said, I still think there's something in this idea, so work on it. So I showed the show to a couple of people I worked with, one of whom was Tad Stones, who's the creator of Darkwing Duck.
Oh.
And Tad was at TV Animation with me, but he used to be at Feature Animation, still had a bunch of friends over at Feature Animation. So he had seen an early print, unfinished print of this movie, which you may have heard of. It was kind of successful for the company, Beauty and the Beast. I don't know if you've heard of that, but
the TV show?
No,
the movie.
The movie, the animated movie.
Oh, of course,
Disney.
yes.
So he had seen that. So he said, you got all these cute little gargoyles. What if instead you had one big gargoyle? Because we had a female hero, human hero. He's like, what if you did a sort of Beauty and the Beast thing with this, with one big gargoyle? And that really clicked for me. So an artist named Greg Weisman and I created the character of Goliath. And there was no version of Goliath in the comedy development. And we took the whole rest of the comedy show and we put it through the prism of Goliath. And we came out the other end with the action drama show that you're familiar with. And we got very excited about this. And again, my background was superheroes. My graphic background wasn't funny animals anyway. So we came up with all these great ideas, the pack and the mutates and all this stuff. And we did this huge pitch, like 40 cards of art, which we showed to Michael Eisner 6 months after he'd rejected the comedy stuff. And he said, no, I don't like this. And
wow.
We had a meeting afterward with Jeffrey Katzenberg. So Michael in those days was head of the entire Walt Disney company. Jeffrey was chairman of the Walt Disney Studios. So he was sort of Michael's number 2 guy. And back then they were in sync. Later they'd fight and Jeffrey would break off and found DreamWorks and stuff. But this was back when they were still, a team. And so the next day we had what we called a post-mortem meeting with Jeffrey. And we were actually there to talk about the show that Michael had said yes to. I can't remember which one it was. It was probably Goof Troop, maybe Bonkers. Like, what would the next steps be to get that going? Because that was the show Michael wanted. And then as we're literally, I'm leaving. I'm standing up to go as the meeting's over. Jeffrey turns to me and says, "Oh, and you're going to keep working on Gargoyles, right?" And I looked at him and I said, "Well, no. We pitched it as a comedy," and he said no. And we pitched it as a drama, and he said no. I don't know what he's like. Oh, he didn't say no. He just thought it needed more work. Well, I had been there yesterday, and I knew that he had said no. But what that meant to me is that Jeffrey liked it. And he wasn't going to contradict Michael, but he thought there was something in it, and he wanted me to keep going on it. So I sat down with my team, and we looked at the pitch, and we looked at the show, and they're like, so what are we going to change about this show this time? And I said, we're not changing this show. This show is great. The problem isn't the show. The problem is the pitch. We took all these ideas we had, ideas that, by the way, we ended up putting in the show later, but we said, these are distracting, Michael. They're taking it away from the core of the idea. We're talking about the pack and all these villains and all these things, all great shit. But it's getting in the way of him getting the core idea. So I just kept cutting things from the pitch. We went from 40 cards down to 28. I mean, more than 40, down to 28. And even that was long. But we really focused the pitch on the Elisa-Goliath relationship. Now, by this time, Beauty and the Beast had come out and was a huge, massive hit for the company. So we really made this without coming out and saying it. We never used the phrase Beauty and the Beast. We really made it a Beauty and the Beast pitch. And so we went and pitched that to Michael 6 months later. And this time he said yes. And I have to say, from that point on, Michael, Jeffrey, Gary, Bruce, all these people I worked for, Rich Frank, were huge champions for this show. Huge. And so Michael ordered it. And when the meeting was over, after Michael had said yes to it, Jeffrey stood up. Keep in mind, I had all I'd done was subtract things from the pitch that I thought were distracting. But Jeffrey came up and said, "You added a lot to that, didn't you?" And I said, "Yes, I did, because my mom didn't raise no fool." And then we made the show.
That's awesome.
And again, all that stuff we had pulled out of the pitch, we used because it was good stuff. It just didn't belong in the pitch. And that's how we sold it.
Another Gargoyle story real quick, because it was a very influential show. I don't know if you've ever got this question before, but a lot of my friends, years later will go back, man, that show raised a lot of budding conspiracy theorists because it exposed people to the concept of the Illuminati for the first time. We were all kids, we weren't reading and stuff like that. And so it created this extra mythical like concept from this cartoon. So my question to you is, did you think Gargoyles will have this type of cultural impact when you were making it?
I guess the short answer is no. The longer answer is that we hoped it would. We weren't oblivious to what we were trying to do. I mean, guys like me and Frank and Michael Reeves, who was our first story editor, Jamie Thomason, our voice director, Keith David, who played Goliath. We all had tremendous ambition for the show, but we set out very consciously to make the kind of show we would like to see, and then cross our fingers that the audience agreed with us. And that was a decision we made very early on, that we weren't going to chase or try to guess at what the audience wanted. We were going to make what we wanted to make, and then hope to God they liked it. And that worked for us over and over again. I'm a huge Shakespeare fanboy. In those days, before I had kids or when my kids were really young, I would go all over California, sometimes all over the country, to see Shakespeare shows. So I put a little Shakespeare in the show, and then the people working for me, they'd put Shakespeare in, hoping that, there's Shakespeare, so Greg will like it. And they weren't wrong. They were pandering to me, but they weren't wrong. And so we wound up with a ton of Shakespeare in the show, and people have told me more than once, I learned to love Shakespeare from Gargoyles. I saw Macbeth on Gargoyles, and then I went and read the play, or then we studied the play in high school, and I'm like, oh my God, this is so cool. And that's very gratifying to me and to all of us who worked on the show, that had that kind of effect. My personal belief is not necessarily that the Illuminati doesn't exist per se, but my personal belief is not that there's a secret society running things, because things are such a mess. If there was one secret society running everything, you'd think they'd run it better. So I don't actually believe in the Illuminati myself, but from a fiction standpoint, it's fantastic. So of course we're going to put that in there. And at one point people ask, well, what are you going to put in one? And I'm like, if it's public domain and you give me enough episodes or enough issues of a comic book, it'll get in there eventually. If someone owns it, then no. But if it's Dracula or Frankenstein or, the works of Shakespeare or the works of Dickens or whatever, yeah, give me enough time, enough episodes, it's going to get in there, because we're going to make the Gargoyles universe inclusive of African myths and Norse myths and Greek myths and Shakespeare and King Arthur and everything, because we wanted to come up with a system where all these mythologies, all these legends, all these fictions could work together in some kind of coherent basis. And that included things like the Illuminati, and it includes things like, Midsummer Night's Dream and whatever we could think of. If it fit, it's going in, and that includes Les Miserables or whatever. Obviously not the musical Les Miserables, because that's not public domain. But if you go back to the original novel, then, that's fair game. And so in the recent Gargoyles comic, you saw a character from Les Miserables show up. And that just became one of the hallmarks of the series, was that we would try and be inclusive in that way. And we would try to bring all these mythologies and all these legends and all these stories and see if we could find a coherent way to make it fit. And we would do that. When we started the show, we set the first flashback in the first episode is set in 10th century Scotland. And we chose Scotland because, all right, we wanted our characters to arrive in Manhattan speaking English. Now, if you think about it for 10 seconds, you realize, well, wait, in medieval Scotland, they weren't speaking contemporary English. They were speaking some form of Celtic Gaelic or whatever, Scottish
Right.
Gaelic. But you needed suspension of belief for your audience. So if we had set it in Paris, which is where, when you think of Gargoyles, you think of Hunchback of Notre Dame and you think of Paris, and that's where you really think of Gargoyles for the most part. But if we set it there, it's like, well, wouldn't they be speaking French? Well, if you set it in anywhere in Great Britain, you at least get the benefit of the doubt, that suspension of belief. And we chose Scotland over England because we thought, well, Scotland is further to the north. It's further from quote unquote civilization. This is a very Western oriented viewpoint, I'll admit, but we weren't thinking that way back then. And so it'll seem more believable that humans and gargoyles were living and working together back then. What about Vikings? Vikings are cool.
Right.
It's not like we did any research and said, it should be Vikings. Well, after the fact, we started doing research and we found out to our surprise the Vikings were attacking the west coast of Scotland in the 10th century. And I'm like, we got it right by accident. All right, since we got it right, let's continue to get it right. So I had people, my assistant and a friend of mine who was interested in Scottish history, I had them look up all this history of the era. And we came up with these amazing stories that were historic, true stories. I'm like, well, we got to use this. We got to use this. The true story of Macbeth is in some ways way more interesting than Shakespeare's version. As much as I love Shakespeare's Macbeth, the actual history of Macbeth is even more fascinating. So we use that. And so, we're always inserting these fictional gargoyles characters and stuff, magic and other things, but we weren't contradicting any of the history. The history books might have left things out, like they left out the gargoyles, because that was, that would be like including tales of witchcraft or something like that. But where there were historical facts, we stuck by them, and I've continued to do that as much as I possibly can 30 years later in the comic books.
Let's talk about Young Justice. There's a lot of DC lore in Young Justice. Can you tell us how you were involved in Young Justice?
So Brandon Vietti and I created Young Justice, or developed it. I mean, obviously we didn't create the characters; those existed in DC Comics already. But we basically, I just come off a show called The Spectacular Spider-Man at Sony, and Brandon had just been directing on the Batman.
Under the Red Hood.
He'd done that too. Yeah, I meant the TV show, The Batman.
Oh yeah.
But he'd also directed Batman Under the Red Hood. You're right. And Sam and I knew Brandon a little, like we'd met, but we didn't know each other really well. But Sam thought we'd make great partners. And by the way, Sam was right. He also teamed us with a character designer named Phil Barassa, who would wind up winning an Emmy for his character designs on the first season of Young Justice. And he said, okay, I want you to work on Green Lantern. We got a Green Lantern movie coming up starring Ryan Reynolds. It's going to be huge. So come up with a Green Lantern animated show. By the way, can't use Hal Jordan. You're like, okay. So we developed a Green Lantern show that we just fell in love with, thought it was great. It was, we worked on that for about 3 weeks, and then Sam came to us and said, no Green Lantern. They're delaying the movie, and we need a show sooner than that, so we're putting Green Lantern on hold. I want you to work on Space Ghost. So we got very excited about Space Ghost because Brandon and I both love Space Ghost. And so we spent 3 weeks developing a Space Ghost TV series. We were very excited. And then Sam comes back to us and says, no Space Ghost. Consumer Products doesn't want Space Ghost. They don't think they can sell Space Ghost toys. So do Young Justice. And Brandon and I said, no. We're like, look, you just had Justice League Unlimited on the one hand and Teen Titans on the other hand. Very different shows, both really good, very different. But, where would Young Justice fit? I mean, you've covered both bases. If you looked at the actual Young Justice comic books from the 90s, the tone is very much like the Teen Titans TV series. It's got serious stuff, but it's comedic, and there's a lot of, goofy exchanges and stuff like that. And this is, it's a show about kids who live in a tower. There don't seem to be any adults around, period.
Right.
And you don't deal with their secret identities at all. And then on the other hand, you had Justice League Unlimited with all these heroes, very serious, very, we're taking this deadly serious. And Alan Burnett, Bruce Timm, Dwayne McDuffie, Rich Fogel, phenomenal creators on both shows. I'm like, where would we even fit? We'll get killed. The internet will hate this show. And he's like, well, look, I just like the title. Do whatever you want with it. Just use that title. And we're like, I don't know. And he's like, just think about it for a little bit. So we go away really not happy because we were really excited about Green Lantern. We've been really excited about Space Ghost, and this just seemed like a dead end. And then Brandon came up with this idea, which is, what if instead of doing a superhero show, we did a spy show? What if the Justice League, who have these big symbols on their chest, bat symbol, or the S shield, or Flash's lightning bolt, or the Green Lantern, or all these heroes who have these big targets right on their chest. What if they're the out front heroes and their proteges are the ones who work in secret behind the scenes, in essence as spies for the big heroes? And we do stuff about the mentor-protege relationship. We'd also, unlike Teen Titans, we'd be showing these kids going to school. We'd be showing them in their secret identities. We'd deal with romance and teen issues. We'd really play into all that stuff. And we decided, okay, there'll be a teen show first. Not a superhero teen show, a teen show first, a spy show second, and a superhero show third. And Phil's design style is very realistic, relatively speaking. So we decided, let's ground this thing in reality as much as we can. So I came up with this dumbass notion to do timestamps that at the head of every scene, you'd see the place and the time and the date. Which, by the way, I regretted for the rest of my life.
That's your idea. I loved it.
Yeah, everyone loves it except the guy who has to figure out time zones and do all this math all the time. No one told me there'd be so much math. But that was another thing we did to make it grounded in reality. Brandon and Phil were very determined that it didn't look like everyone bought their costumes at the same superhero, supervillain shop. Costumes are us, or whatever, that everyone's costumes were unique, that Kid Flash would have padding on his knees and elbows, that Robin would have, in essence, Kevlar covering that chest, but that Aqualad, we modeled his on those, there was one Olympics where all the swimmers, instead of wearing, in essence, Speedos, they were wearing these full body suits. And we decided, well, if you're swimming, you wouldn't he wouldn't wear boots. Why the hell does Aquaman wear boots? So we decided that none of the Atlanteans wore shoes. If they were tough enough to exist at the bottom of the ocean, then a little, piece of glass on the street isn't going to bother their feet. They're tough enough for that. So Aqualad would be barefoot, but he'd be wearing this suit. We modeled his body, not his face, but his body off of Michael Phelps's body, the swimmer Michael Phelps.
Right. The long torso.
Right, and the arms, and that kind of thing. And we made Superboy shorter, stockier, still looked like Superman, but different hairstyle, and we wanted to make these characters individuals. And so the two of us started, I compiled a list of all of, I don't know, there must have been like 75 or 80 teen superheroes that Disney had. Not Disney, sorry, DC. For example, there were 4 blonde female teenage archers, because I guess DC thought that 3 blonde female teenage archers wasn't enough, so they had 4 of them. So, we figured out, we started with this huge list of, again, 70 plus teenagers, began to whittle it down little by little. We were looking for characters that mixed superpowers with mad skills. Some would have powers, some would not, but they'd have these skills. We were looking for characters that had interesting backstories. Particularly, we were looking for characters that were keeping secrets or telling lies, because we were a spy show. And also teenagers keep secrets and tell lies. So we were looking for characters that fit that dynamic as well. And a mix of male and female, a mix of all sorts of things, and had good character dynamics with each other. And we wound up with an initial group of 6 heroes, which we introduced a few at a time. We started with 3, Robin, Kid Flash, and Aqualad. Added Superboy, then added Miss Martian, then added Artemis, then later in the season added Zatanna, and then later still added Rocket. So we gradually built to a group of 8, but started small with 3. And
the original 3, right?
You got a great memory. You got a great memory. I got to ask this question about Young Justice. You already mentioned, Greg, that season 1 won an Emmy for character design, but the original series lasted 2 seasons. What leads to a successful animation show being canceled after 2 seasons?
Well, money, or the lack of it. Our show, the bulk of our budget came from a toy deal that Warner Brothers or DC Comics or both had with Mattel. And Mattel, I don't think they did a great job marketing it, but Mattel's Young Justice toy line, in fact, their entire DC Comics toy line, they weren't happy with it. One of the problems was the Green Lantern movie, if I'm being honest. The movie didn't do well, as I'm sure you know. So a lot of stores got stuck with a lot of Green Lantern toys that didn't sell. And those toys took up shelf space, and it made stores hesitant about superhero toys for a little bit. Not for very long, but for a little bit. And so Mattel canceled, partway through our production on season 2, Mattel canceled our toy line, our Young Justice toy line. And that was the whole budget. To Warner Brothers' credit, they could have just pulled the plug on season 2, but they said, okay, instead of 26 episodes, you're going to do 20 episodes for season 2, but you can finish. And so we did 20 episodes, and we knew we were done. And you say you were disappointed as a fan. Think about how disappointed we were, because we were big fans of our show. Plus, we were out of jobs, and that was it. And we thought that would be it. But Then the show started playing on Netflix, and I wasn't even working at Warner Brothers at the time, but I saw a window of opportunity there, and I started a campaign, Keep Binging YJ, hashtag Keep Binging YJ. I started a campaign on what we used to call Twitter. And that campaign was hugely successful, not just in terms of creating attention, but also in getting people to binge YJ a lot. And
I know
I was working at Nickelodeon on a preschool show called Shimmer and Shine when Sam called me and said, "Hey, we think there's a window of opportunity here. We'd like to bring YJ back." And I think for Sam, literally part of the appeal was he wanted to see if he could do it. Can we take a show that's been off the air for 5 years and bring it back? And so we actually went to Netflix to pitch season 3 to them.
Yeah.
And an interesting thing happened at that meeting. We were pitching to 2 Netflix executives. One who was more creative and one who's more of the business guy, right? So the business guy had a laptop, and we're all the Warner Brothers people, including me, even though I didn't work at Warner Brothers at the time, are sitting on one side of the table, and the 2 Netflix executives are sitting on the other side of the table, and the business guy has a laptop. And every time I'd shift in my seat, he'd like move the laptop like he was afraid that that I was peeking somehow. I couldn't see it, right? It was facing him, and I'm across from him. I can't see anything, but he was very paranoid about us seeing the numbers from Netflix. It got to the point that, because I'm a son of a bitch, it got to the point that during the meeting, I started to go like this, just to see how he'd react. And at one point in the meeting, he goes, "Well, look, I'm looking at the numbers here, and the numbers for season 1 are fantastic, but the numbers for season 2 are just okay. So maybe the show's run its course. Maybe there shouldn't be a season 3." And I said, "Wait, you guys are only airing season 1. You can't have any numbers for season 2. You're not showing it yet." Like they were planning to, but they hadn't released season 2 yet. So I'm like, "Where are you getting any numbers for season 2? And then the creative guy leans over. He's sitting next to the business guy. He leans over and looks at the guy's laptop, and he goes, "You're looking at Brazil." So he wasn't looking at numbers for the U.S. He was looking at numbers for Brazil, where they, I guess, were showing both season 1 and season 2. So he, does some magic with his keyboard, and clearly he then is now looking at the domestic numbers. And I want to play poker with this guy someday because his eyes go wide. And then he slams the laptop down. He goes, "Yeah, those numbers are respectable. They're respectable." And that had an interesting result. See, Sam saw that. So we had thought it was doing well on Netflix, but we didn't know because Netflix does not share those numbers with anybody.
Oh, wow.
But what that told Sam was it wasn't just doing well, it was doing phenomenally well. So instead of selling it to Netflix, they decided to create an entire streaming service of their own, which was called DC Universe.
Yep.
And build it around Young Justice and the Young Justice fans. So they built this streaming service, and the streaming service got very excited about everything other than Young Justice, because Young Justice, it was inherited. But they started the live action Titan show. They had they had Doom Patrol, they had Swamp Thing, they had Harley
Quinn, yep.
And they were very excited about all those shows, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we've got Young Justice." That's right. Now, really, it was our fans that were bringing everyone to the streaming service in the first place. And I'm not knocking those other shows, but it was really annoying to us that we were the whole reason the service existed, and we were always treated like, and there's Young Justice, season 3 of Young Justice. And then we wound up doing phenomenally well. So I think even reluctantly, DC Universe picked up the 4th season of Young Justice. And then DC Universe went away because HBO Max came in.
Right.
And then we got shuttled over to HBO Max for season 4, but we were already halfway done with it. So the good news is the HBO Max people said, hey, you guys know what you're doing. We're going to leave you alone. You're not going to get any notes from us, which is great. The flip side of that was they also didn't really care about us because they were really interested in the shows that they were greenlighting and they were creating. So again, like we were at DC Universe, it was like, yeah, we've got this and we got that, and we got the other thing. Oh, and we've got the 4th season. And by the time we were done, it was like, oh, there are 98 episodes, and we weren't canceled. They just didn't pick us up for a 5th season. And I don't think it's impossible that we might come back. It took 5 years between season 2 and season 3, so maybe in 5 years there'll be a season 5. But they don't seem interested right at the moment.
Hey, Greg, let's go on to Lucasfilm. So you worked on Star Wars Rebels. We hear the folks at Lucasfilm are real sticklers for continuity. Were there any creative restrictions while developing Star Wars Rebels?
I came to Rebels when it was largely fully formed. Dave Filoni and Simon Kinberg and I were the 3 executive producers on the 1st season, and David and Simon had been working on Rebels for some time before I even got there. I like to think I contributed, certainly on story, and there were little things I contributed, like Zeb and Hera and Kanan and Sabine and Ezra. They all had first names, and I'm like, what are their last names? And they're like, what? I'm like, this is Star Wars. His name isn't Luke, it's Luke Skywalker. What are their last names? And they're like, we didn't think about that. So I gave them all last names. My biggest single contribution is I came up with Zeb's curse word, Carabas. So now the Star Wars universe has a curse word, which it didn't have before. I full casting and everything. Continuity matters as long as it matters. And then, if they've got a really good reason for them to say, well, we're going to stretch this a little, then, they let it go. Most of the credit for Rebels should go to Filoni.
But you did add some continuity. You were the continuity buff because you were like, hey, wait a minute. The characters got to have last names. That's a big deal.
There's some of that. They probably would have come to it eventually, I like to think, even without me. The truth is that we had a couple of huge Star Wars guys on the team who really knew the lore up, down, and sideways. And I can't claim that I was one of those people. I mean, I love Star Wars, and it was a dream come true to work on Rebels. But I don't know it the way, for example, I know DC Comics continuity. And so, I was constantly contacting people and going, hey, we need something that's like this. Is there anything? And they'd always have something for me, So we kept in continuity a lot. Sometimes we created new stuff, but we made sure it fit. That mattered, especially since, Rebels was the first Star Wars thing to come out after Disney bought Lucasfilm. So it was a huge priority for the company. If it had done poorly, it would have freaked fans out and made them very nervous for things like the movies. I mean, things that for Disney were huge billion-dollar kind of investments. So we had an outsized role in the company for at least that brief period of time because we were the first Star Wars thing to come out. And that put a big spotlight on everything we did. And sometimes that was great. Sometimes that was painful. But
it paid off though, Greg. And it was as much indoctrination I put on my son with Star Wars. It was Rebels that actually, it was the IP that resonated with him, and now he's as much as a Star Wars fan as I am. Last couple of questions here. Your current title, Spectacular Spider-Man. If you were a fan of the show, Spectacular Spider-Man, right? Why should they pick up this book?
They're not in the same continuity. So right off the bat, I don't want to fool people into thinking, oh, this is the same continuity as the TV show. They're not. This is main Marvel Universe continuity. But I think tonally, if you liked the TV show Spectacular Spider-Man, you liked the quippage, you liked the way we portrayed Peter as a 16-year-old, now picture him as a 26-year-old working with Miles, who's 16. I think you're going to find quite a bit of resonance there. I've also cherry-picked a supporting cast that includes characters that from a Marvel standpoint are kind of obscure, but if you watch the show, you'll get. So we've got Kenny Kong in there, we've got Shashan Wen in there, we've got Raymond Aaron Warren in there, and others chosen from all sorts of different eras, and I think it's a lot of fun. And I think, again, if you like the show, you're going to find that tonal resonance in this book. But I also think, if you really want a reason to buy this book, I'm going to say two words: Humberto Ramos.
Yes, sir.
Forget what I'm writing. You got Humberto Ramos doing Spider-Man again. It doesn't get any better than that. So
that's enough said, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm having a blast writing this book. I think we're having more and more fun with every issue, and I like the first issue, but I'm currently writing the 7th issue now, and it just gets bigger and better, and so I think people should pick it up, and they should also pick up Gargoyles Quest, which is the Gargoyles book I'm doing for Dynamite, and is in continuity with the original TV series, everything.
That's awesome, because that was my last question. Is there anything that we haven't discussed that you would like your fans to know about? And you mentioned Gargoyles Quest. Obviously, you're writing Spectacular Spider-Man. But are there any other projects upcoming or anything that's happening currently that you would like to share?
The two things that I've got to plug are Spectacular Spider-Man issue. By the time this comes out, I think issue 4 will probably be out, and issue 5's probably right around the corner. And Gargoyles Quest from Dynamite Comics, which features Damona's big plan to take control of the entire human race, is issue 3 should be either just out or just about to come out in July. So pick up those books. We both have phenomenal artists on them, and I'm really proud of the writing on them. And again, great characters from the Spider-Man universe, great characters from the Gargoyle universe. I think they've turned out great.
Awesome, Greg. Thank you for joining us. This man, I mean, the in-depth information about Gargoyles and that's. This is a bucket list interview for me, so I'm so happy that you were here. So you always have a home here on the 6 Layer Station, so thank you. Well, that's all for our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe and hit the like button. This is 6 Layers. I'm Mike, speaking for Mark and Greg Weisman. We are out. Peace.
6 Layers.